Well, in the 48 hours following the attack, more than 140 Islamophobic hate crimes were registered by the group Tell Mama. Support for the Facebook page of the far-right street organisation the English Defence League skyrocketed, and marches and attacks on mosques have become more frequent. A demonstration on Saturday by the far-right British National Party was blocked by anti-fascist demonstrators, but their dwindling numbers have been in marked contrast to the rise in support for the English Defence League, who led thousands of supporters outside Downing Street the previous weekend. John, what do you make of the connection here between the kind of establishment political response and what's been happening with the far right?
Well, I think the important thing about the far right response is how trivial it has been. Actually, I mean, there was supposed to be a big demonstration at the weekend, and I could see about 24 people outside the Houses of Parliament. Because they were prevented from demonstrating in Woolwich. So I think we really have to avoid, I think, as we should avoid sensationalising people like Anjem Choudhury, we should avoid suggesting that the EDL and the BNP are significant forces. I mean, certainly they've got quite a presence online, but you know, as anybody who's been on the internet ever knows, you know, there are a lot of very mad people online.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Peter, that's certainly true what John said about last weekend. I mean, it was a pretty pathetic turnout. But the BNP's been declining, but the EDL hasn't. And the previous weekend was an EDL demonstration, which was probably bigger than they've had for some time.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know a lot about the far. But I think that is the far right. Neither of these organisations have any mainstream support in this country. They're never going to, as far as I can tell. And I think we can take a certain amount of comfort from that. I am, though, concerned about the rise of these attacks on mosques. I mean, I think, is it right, there's been 11 attacks on mosques?
I think more, but yeah.
Well, what I was astonished was that it was regarded as normal. The normal level of attacks on mosques was 4 a day, and that had gone up to sort of 40. I mean, presumably some of that's quite minor, but I mean, even spray painting and graffiti is unpleasant. I mean, I think that is worrying, but again, we shouldn't dignify it with too much of the idea that there's some sort of great big sort of groundswell of opinion in this country against Islam.
Do you think there's a connection between? I mean, if we're not focusing so much on an actual organised political expression in the form of the BNP or the EDL, and this is quite marginal at the moment. Do you think that there's a more dangerous, perhaps, relationship between the kind of media response, some sections of the political class, and a kind of generalised anti-Muslim feeling, which then results in the individual attacks? Peter?
I do think that can happen. That there is a language in some of the newspapers which is ugly about Muslims, and I think it's idle to pretend that can't lead to the sort of attacks which sort of unsophisticated, stupid, evil, bigoted people take. And and I think that's something that newspapers really ought to be very careful. I was very glad, actually, that Leveson inquiry had an element. I know that the Islam Channel, I think, put in a submission, and that was extremely important that it should have done so. I'm absolutely certain that some of the reporting, which I made a television programme for Channel 4 about this a few years ago, and terrible examples we found of completely fabricated incidents which put Muslims in a very bad light, and this was done without abusing the press laws in any way.
Well, I mean, I think, I agree. I think, Nick Robinson, the BBC's political editor, made a terrible mistake live on air when he said that some of the suspects were of Muslim appearance. But the important point about that is he realised immediately that it was a mistake, and he apologised for it. And I think the important thing is that, as we saw Muslim imams disowning the attack, and I think we should also hope to see prominent Muslim activists. I mean, there are some left-wing Muslim activists who tried to make the link between this and British foreign policy, which I think is completely illegitimate, and I think that should be taken on and argued with. Although I completely accept the right of people to make those points.
Although, I mean, whatever you think about the rightness or the wrongness of that connection, it was made on video. Now, whatever you think about the wrongness of that as a justification or motivation, it's surely there.
Yes, but then to imply that it's somehow justified, or to imply that there's something, that somehow British foreign policy should be decided because a minority of people, disagree with it very, very strongly. I think that is completely wrong and should be resisted utterly.
Pete, do you think there's any connection between without at all suggesting that this is part of a UKIP policy or that they would endorse it, that there's an increase in debate and concern over the question of immigration? Does this in any way shade into the kind of Islamophobia that we've been discussing?
I haven't looked into that issue and asked that question, so I don't know.
Well, I think it clearly does. I mean, UKIP is against immigration. I mean, it's an equal opportunity opposer of immigration because it's opposed to immigration from non-white people and from Muslims and from and it's opposed to immigration from Eastern Europe on a completely equal colour-blind and religion-blind basis, but is not opposed very much to immigration from Germany and France and other countries that we regard as more like ours.
Okay, well, it's almost as if history were repeating itself when former Prime Minister Tony Blair, to say the least, a controversial figure in the Muslim world, wrote a column in the Mail on Sunday saying that there's a problem within Islam and that the seeds of future fanaticism and of terror, possibly even of a major conflict, are being sown. Mayor of London Boris Johnson has called for gender segregation to be restricted in university Islamic societies as a precursor to stamping out supposed hate preachers. A member of the Conservative Muslim Forum, Mohammed Amin, put forward the idea that compiling a list of such hate preachers, although this has been met with hostility within his own ranks, might be a good idea.
Having lists of people who are not criminals, which are kept in the hands of government, isn't consistent with liberal democratic values. And I worry that lists are kept where they may be kept on a CD-ROM and they are forgotten in a briefcase or something, and they are spread around, and it can cause vigilante behaviour. We know that following the Woolwich murder that happened, as awful as it was, there have been a huge number of reprisals on Muslim communities up and down the country. So it's vigilante behaviour, but it's also not consistent with liberal democratic values. And actually the Human Rights Act specifies that the government should not be involved in unnecessarily surveillance of individuals without just cause.
I'm worried about a lot of the language Boris Johnson used last week, Tony Blair used, that political Islam is a pathway to terrorism. I don't understand. I really need to see evidence for that. I think that somebody who advocates a caliphate, as HT do, it may be a bonkers idea, but I think it's perfectly legitimate. I don't think it's a pathway to anything. I think it's a perfectly legitimate political idea, and it worked for many hundreds of years in the Ottoman Empire, and so forth. So I'm very worried about this proposition we're now getting that somehow certain ideas put you on the wanted list.
Well, I think you're complacent, if I may say so, Peter, because I think there is clearly an Al-Qaeda ideology which is based on that and which does lead to the Al-Qaeda
ideology is hang on, Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organisation with a nihilistic joy and violence. But
it is animated by that kind of political ideology.
I mean, but the political Islam, which nobody really tries to define, it also defines roughly, apparently, the government of Iran, which is at war with Al-Qaeda, more or less, and doesn't, as far as I'm fairly certain to say, Shia Islam does not pose a threat on the streets of London. So you've really got to sort of Turkey. Is an Islamist country.
Yeah.
Are we going to lock up Mr. Erdogan? And therefore, obviously not.
You know perfectly well what people like Tony Blair are talking about when they're talking about the perversion of Islam. They're not talking about the Turkish system.
Well, he says that political Islam takes one on he said in his article on this conveyor belt.
Yes, he's talking about Hizb ut-Tahrir, and he's talking about Al-Qaeda, and he's talking about all those kinds of ideological organisations which connect political Islam to violence.
What about the question of the sort of the list of hate preachers, which is now obviously been brought forward by people in the Conservative Muslim Forum, but also being debated and objected to by people?
Well, again, it's an obviously stupid idea in the sense that you've got to define what is a hate preacher. But on the other hand, I would rather the security services and the government had some idea of what was being preached in mosques around the country. Whereas, I think a few years ago certainly there was a widespread reluctance to get involved in the religious, the private sphere. My Muslim friends would tell me that people were saying terrible things in their local mosque, and nothing was done about it.
I think we need to address it more carefully, though. I mean, it seems to me that incitement to violence is already a crime.
Yeah.
Anti-Semitism is already a crime.
I agree.
And if we're going to, therefore, make a list of people whose views we don't like, this is really frightening. This is totalitarian. I'll give you an example. Let's take the example of Raed Salah. Came here before last. Very distinguished Palestinian politician. Locked up by us, control order for 9 months or whatever it was. Really appalling moment in the history of the British state. And that is just somebody being locked up with no justification, as the courts later discovered, just because his views were unacceptable to the Home Office. And I think this is something we really need to worry about. So this list of hate preachers is a very slippery slope.
Mm. I mean, isn't that the point, really, John, that, that where you have somebody saying, OK, let's go and kill X, a direct incitement to violence, or even, let's go and kill Muslims, or let's go and kill black people, or whatever, there's an issue here. But even whether or not you agree with it, and you may utterly oppose it, a kind of general discussion of political violence, especially as it might apply in Palestine, isn't in the same category. Never mind about even more general formulations.
No, well, I totally agree with what Peter's saying there. But I think there was a problem, and I don't know how much of a problem there is now, of preachers preaching not in English and the security services in this country having no idea what was going on in some of the mosques. And I think I think it's better that they do know what's going on rather than not.
Peter?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to prevent. I mean, clearly there are plots to kill innocent people in this country, and we need to do our best to stop them. And it sounds like we often do.
Although interestingly, you use the word prevent, but the prevent scheme, the preventing violent extremism scheme, really hit the buffers in the last days of the Labour government. I mean, it was proving inoperable. It was proving that there was enormous discontent about the channeling of funds to particular organisations.
I think it's very difficult for governments to get involved in that kind of activity. I mean, I think one of the things I do agree with Tony Blair about is that if there is a problem within Islam, then it's got to be solved within Islam. I mean, I think it's
well, that is to follow on from that argument. I think it's essential that it retains the confidence of the Muslim community in this country. And if you go out of your way to say ban Raed Salah on a visit to lock him up, very distinguished figure at the heart of Al-Aqsa Mosque and all. I mean, you're just telling the Muslim community that your motive is not to prevent violence in this country. Your motive is to push forward a particular political point of view. Mm. And that's the moment you completely lose the support of ordinary, decent Muslims. And so I think that there needs to be an intelligent approach to what is going on. I think the existing laws, which prevent incitement to violence, which legislate against preaching sectarian or religious hatred, they seem to me to be very good. I think we need to be very careful before we're going to go any further.
Mm. As is often the case after a supposed terror attack, politicians across the spectrum have been calling for a renewed focus on security and anti-terror legislation. Home Secretary Theresa May has called for the Communications Data Bill, also referred to as a Snoopers Charter, which would force internet service providers to hand information to the authorities about ordinary citizens' online activity. She wants this bill to be resurrected. She claims it would have gone some way to preventing the attack, although MI5 have disputed this. The Liberal Democrats were responsible for blocking the legislation in the past, but they may face pressure now to drop their opposition. Regardless, the Prime Minister has set up the Tackling Extremism and Radicalisation Task Force to curb the actions of extremists. John, what do you think about this?
Well, I think Theresa May, I mean the Home Secretary, she made a mistake in linking the so-called Snoopers Charter to Woolwich and suggesting that it could have prevented the attack. I mean, I think that was a foolish thing to do. But actually, the government wants to press ahead with this legislation anyway, and should make the case without reference to Woolwich, because I mean, actually, the case for the so-called Snoopers Charter is a reasonably strong one, and if it can pass scrutiny in the House of Commons, then I think it should be passed.
Do you think that it seems to me one of the remarkable things about the discussion in the media about this, it's now come to light beyond all possibility of refutation, that the security services not only knew these people, but knew them intimately. Indeed, were trying to recruit them.
Yes.
So the whole argument, which follows the line that we needed to know more, whatever its general, usefulness might be, simply doesn't apply in this case.
Well, this goes back to my point about, regarding them as, unhappy, maladjusted, strange individuals, rather than, the representatives of an ideology. Because, however interested they were in this ideology, what made them flip in the end is deeply sort of human and individual. And the sort of thing that happens to sort of lone, one hesitates to use sort of mental health language, but I mean sort of lone, maladjusted people, especially young men.
I'll just bring you back to because this section is about the security services and the extension of security things. I mean, I just want to put the point perhaps more clearly than I did before. Whatever the precise chain and combination of events and ideas that led these people to flip, as the family, John said it, the family is saying, we don't know what caused them to do. One element in this was the behaviour of our own security services in regard to the time, certainly that Michael Adebayo spent in Kenya, and their attempts to recruit him afterwards. Now, it seems clear that at least there is the possibility that this contributed to them doing what they did. It certainly didn't prevent them from doing what they did.
Well, I don't want to speculate about whether that may have contributed to it, but I mean, I would rather the security services were engaged with these people and knew what they were doing and had some sort of understanding of where they were getting their ideas and where those ideas might lead. I would rather that the security services were involved rather than not. I mean, I think so. I wouldn't criticise them for having some form of engagement with these people.
Peter?
Yeah, it seems pretty obvious that our security services have got to find out what's going on if people are planning terrorist acts. And not knowing the facts, none of us do, but I don't automatically blame them in this case either, because they can't just lock everybody up on suspicion. Absolutely not. So I think that what does worry me a bit is we're suddenly getting all this talk about new legislation.
Well, actually, it's old legislation that was proposed beforehand. And what I'm saying is that Theresa May's mistake was to link Woolwich. I mean, the whole problem with Woolwich is that, as with everything like this, something like that happens, and for everybody, it confirms them in what they thought before, and it becomes evidence for what they wanted to do anyway. And I wish people would just leave Woolwich to one side and make the arguments for what they believe in.
I mean, John, in a way, this brings us back to the point that you made right at the head of the programme, and that is that, this does look much more, obviously as a political context, but it looks much more like an individual politically motivated murder than it does a systematic connection to either any ongoing campaign or political terrorism. So, in a certain sense, the generalised political responses are kind of beside the point.
Well, I absolutely think so, and that's where I disagree with Tony Blair about the significance of Woolwich, because I don't think it is a part of a general problem, and Peter will be very pleased to hear me say that. But I think there is still a problem within Islam. I think Tony Blair is right about that. In that we do have a problem. It's largely not in this country, I suspect. But we do have a problem with a perversion of Islam which leads to violence. I do think we have a problem in this country with the broad Muslim community regarding British foreign policy as somehow being anti-Muslim, as if we invaded Iraq or Afghanistan because they were Muslim countries, which is palpably absurd, and yet you do not hear Muslims standing up and making that point.
Well, is that not partly because at least some of the people who advocated the war, Samuel Huntington famously in the Clash of Civilizations, said that that's precisely what the problem was, and in some ways,
that's not a serious person. I mean, that is nothing to do with British,
I tend to
policy.
agree with you, but they may not be serious, but it was widespread and widely supported.
No, but that was not the guiding principles of British policy. I mean, whether you agree with the invasion of Iraq or not, it was not about invading a Muslim country because it was Muslim. It was about Saddam Hussein's failure to comply
I
with
rather
human
agree with
resolutions.
you about that. I mean, obviously, I think the reason the invasion of Iraq was precisely was whatever it was. I think it was about
You
oil.
can't remember now.
No,
No, it wasn't about oil either, Peter, but carry on.
Whatever it was, there was a formal reason, which weapons of mass destruction, which we can differ. Something was going on. I think it was about oil. I don't think it was anti-Islamic as such. Afghanistan, well, clearly it was harbouring Al-Qaeda, which had just done the Twin Towers. That said, I think a lot of our conduct since has been very troubling. Our engagement in extraordinary rendition and torture.
But again, that's not an anti-Muslim.
Well, I'm sorry, gentlemen, we are going to have to, just as we move to the more interesting questions of the whole debate, we're going to have to stop there. But we will be, of course, returning to this issue because I'm sure that the issues raised by the Woolwich murders won't be disappearing from our political discourse anytime soon, and we will be coming back to them in future editions of the Politics and Media programme.